Hit the red record button.
It's already recording.
What? You know as much about the CFA as basically what you've learned from me. I know as much about med school as what I've learned from you. So which one is harder?
Well, I think the thing is they're just so different. With med school, there's just so many little steps to get it. Well, you get so many people who think they want to do it going into undergrad. You know, they start out as pre-med, they fail their first biology class, and then you lose half of them. And then some people don't make it to the MCAT. You get a fair amount of people who take the MCAT and fail it, or do well enough to apply but don't get any interviews.
Well, thanks for being on for the conversation. Can you kind of give yourself a little bit of an introduction, explain where you're at in your career now?
I'm Jordan Hatch. I am a first-year family medicine resident. I have finished med school. I am a doctor. I've got a couple more years of training under a supervising doctor team before I go out and practice on my own.
And for anyone who might be newer to the channel, I'm AJ. I'm a CFA charter holder and a financial advisor working in wealth management for a handful of years now. If you had to take a guess, how many people start off in undergrad hoping to be pre-med majors and otherwise end up not doing that?
I would say probably 80% of us fell off before even taking the MCAT.
People just starting off in the college journey towards being a doctor, about 80% of them won't even take the first step towards medical school.
Yeah, that'd probably be my guess.
As a point of comparison, in finance, of everyone starting off who would like to be offering investment advice in their career, I would guess the journey to medical school has a much lower kind of pass-through rate. Once you're talking about the MCAT exam, how many people pass that versus fail that?
So it's not really pass-fail, it's scored, sort of like the ACT or the SAT. And there's sort of a minimum threshold you hope to get if you want to go to an MD school versus a DO school is a little bit lower. Out of people who take it, usually about
Wait, what did he do?
It's just only in boxers.
So there's a certain threshold for MD, a certain threshold for DO. How many people score under a threshold that you cannot continue with? Like the score is so low you can't continue on the journey to becoming a doctor.
I think about 50% of people score above a 500, and 500 is sort of the minimum that you want to get to apply to a DO school.
What'd you score?
512.
Okay, what's a top tier like brain surgery or plastic surgery?
I had some classmates who got in the 520s. 528 is
That's a small range.
Yeah.
500 is too little, 520 is the max?
528 is the max.
Okay. When you take the MCAT, still in undergrad?
Yeah, usually your third year, the summer before you start your last.
So if there's 100 students, 20% of them will take the MCAT, and then half of those, so 20 people, so 10 people will actually attend medical school for the first year after undergrad.
Or probably more accurately, 10 of those will get a number of interviews for schools. 70-80% of those people who get a good amount of interviews will actually matriculate into a school.
Okay.
But also there's a lot more that goes into it than just your MCAT.
10 people do interviews, and probably 7 will end up attending medical school. Is that fair to say? 7 of the original 100 that started pursuing it in undergrad. What else is there other than the MCAT?
GPA is a big thing. GPA and the MCAT are sort of the two objective ways that candidates are compared. Mm-hmm. And then you've got things like volunteering, time in hospitals, letters of recommendation are huge. Sure. You know, just little things like that. And then really all of that just points towards getting an interview, the interview that seals it.
So maybe 7 out of 100 though still, under that scenario.
Yeah.
Okay. If we started with 100 in finance, I'm saying 75% of the people who may start out in their career hoping to be working in investment-related decision-making work probably take CFA level 1. That could be generous because it's a difficult program. Let's say 60 of them will sign up to take level 1. We're saying 7 of the 100 actually start medical school. Okay, so right away, we have a pretty big difference in comparison. Now the next stage in the career, first of all, describe the process through medical school once you actually start it.
Well, really each year of medical school is pretty different. Your first year, you're doing basic science stuff.
Basic.
Molecular biology, genetics, pharmacology, things like that.
Basic.
Where you're building up towards... And then second year, you get into your system-based classes, cardiology, renal, pulmonary, that kind of thing. And that all leads to this big test that you take typically the end of your second year. It's called Step 1, USMLE Step 1. I guess that would be the best comparison to the CFA Level 1. After that, your third and fourth year are considered your clinical years. So third year, you spend time doing all your rotations, like internal medicine, family practice, psychiatry, general surgery. Fourth year, you really narrow down what you want to do some more electives, where you spend a lot of time trying to get letters of recommendation.
Okay. Go back to that step 1 exam. Is there a portion of our 7 people who have made it to med school that will score too low on that exam that they quit their med school journey?
Thankfully, that's a pretty small percentage. It'd be pretty easy to find the statistic of people who don't pass it. It used to be scored. I think actually this year is the first year that it's just pass-fail. Typically, it has been the test to sort of separate people into competitive specialties like orthopedic surgery, plastics, dermatology, that kind of thing.
And we'll get into that later on because that can be a huge difference for the direction your career takes, depending on what specialty you're in, which partly depends on your score on that exam.
The pass rate, I think, is somewhere in the 95%.
So of the 7, we can probably still assume on average 7 are getting through.
For the most part.
We wouldn't trim it down to 6 yet.
Right.
Okay. And then after the 4th year of medical school, is it fair to assume that all 7 people who probably got through that point will become a doctor, just some in relatively more difficult specialties than others? Or will some of those people ultimately choose a different career path?
Some of them certainly do, but it's a pretty small percentage. So I think for the most part, you could say all 7 will.
I think an important point of comparison here is where we want to kind of say the journey begins, because a lot of what Jordan talked about was people who start out their undergrad program wanting to become doctors and throughout that college journey fail some science-based classes and decide to do some other career path. And the CFA exams really start your journey towards them after undergrad. So if we're including the group of people who choose not to pursue medical school through undergrad, obviously it's a much lower succession rate to ultimately becoming a doctor. But if we say after undergrad is our start point, because these are the people who seriously want to pursue it, the people who ultimately become CFA charter holders will be a smaller percentage. You'll just see far more people getting to that point, people who eventually take level 1 than people who eventually pursue medical school, I think. So it's tough to compare apples to apples, but for the sake of the conversation, I think that's an important difference. So to wrap that point up, after undergrad, not including any college or university, about how many years does it take for someone to start off on the path to becoming a doctor until they are a doctor?
After undergrad, after the 4 years of undergrad, typically, it's 4 years of med school.
Okay, and then after those 4 years, you become a doctor, but you have a handful of years of the residency that you're doing right now?
Yeah, so after med school, you do a residency, which is anywhere from 3 to 7 years. Most non-surgical specialties are in the 3-year range, and most surgeries are 5 to 7.
So I think that might be pretty comparable to the CFA program, actually. The average charter holder will take, I think it's 4.1 or 4.2 years from the time they register to take the level 1 exam until they not just pass the level 3 exam, but also get their work experience approved to the point where they are a CFA charter holder. And then you might say that there is kind of an entry-level CFA charter holder workplace position where you are doing some investment decision making, but you might have a 3 to 5 year period of time, similar to what Jordan just described, until you're actually what maybe you would call a portfolio manager or in a similar role to that. Again, not talking about undergrad or university, but when you start off in that first year of medical school, about how many hours are you spending in a month and in a year throughout the entire medical school journey, either in class or working in hospitals if you do that, or just studying?
Like I was saying, each year is different. First year, with your basic sciences, people typically spend about 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day studying.
8 to 10 to 12 hours just studying every day.
Just studying, yeah. For us, we had about 4 hours of class every day, which wasn't mandatory, so not a lot of people went, but the rest of the time you spend studying. In second year, you're studying for step 1, which is essentially the whole point of your first 2 years.
Okay.
I spent about 14 hours a day studying.
For how long?
6 weeks of a dedicated period of 14 to 16 hours a day.
Okay.
Leading up to that, about 6 months of at least 12 hours a day.
So that's 600 hours or so in the 6 weeks right before the exam, and maybe another 1,000 in the preceding 6 or 9 months. So yeah, that's a lot more than we would spend studying for a CFA exam, I think.
My numbers were probably a little bit more than a lot of my classmates, but certainly not the most. Usually around 8 to 10 hours a day for those first 2 years.
But a big difference, obviously, with people pursuing the CFA designation is 95 or more percent of them are also working full-time jobs at that time. More than half of those jobs are working between 50 and 60 hours a week. Sure, there are some near the 40-hour mark, and sure, there are some north of 60, 70 hours a week. But in general, if you said you're working 50 hours a week and also studying 3 hours a day, maybe 20 hours a week, then you get to that 70-hour per week number. Still not on par with what some medical students are studying for, but I think that gets us to a more apples-to-apples comparison. Except I would definitely say that studying for 12 hours a day is much more draining physically and emotionally and spiritually and mentally than working for 12 hours a day in a job that you probably at least enjoy somewhat.
And get paid.
And get paid. That's a big difference. Do you think there's any enjoyment to those long study days like there might be if you were working in a finance job during a long 12-hour shift?
I think for a lot of my classmates, no. But
Okay.
for me, I really enjoyed it because it felt like rewarding to feel like I know something.
Sure.
We would have practice tests weekly. Each time my score went up, it felt like a good use of my time.
Okay, yeah, I can relate to that. Because you kind of have a benchmark that you're tracking every week.
Yeah,
and you know you're
absolutely.
improving.
Then in third and fourth year, things change up quite a bit. Third year, when you're in your clinical rotations, that's just like a normal job, essentially. You go to work like you would. A lot of outpatient medicine is 8 to 5 or 9 to 5. So then you're working 40-hour weeks, 45-hour weeks. A lot of inpatient stuff is closer to 70, 75 hours a week. Really just depends on the rotation you're in.
This is all while you're still in medical school?
Yes.
Are you still studying during this period of time when you might be working 40 to 60 hours a week?
Much less. We usually do have tests at the end of each rotation, like a final exam for general surgery, let's say, at the end of a 4-week or 6-week rotation. Usually you study throughout, but for the most part, what you're doing at the hospital is preparing you for that.
We have an idea now about the period of time, which I think is pretty comparable, the amount of hours spent, and for a CFA candidate, if you include the hours spent working plus studying, I think we're at maybe 75% of what someone in medical school might spend. Let's try to get an idea, just for the purposes of the conversation, on the difficulty of the content. Because for the level 1 CFA exam, people have said it in the past, that material is not rocket science. A lot of it isn't too much more difficult than what you would see in a lot of university or undergrad finance or economics or accounting classes. But a big
You're so good at just like keeping on going.
But a big part of the difficulty of passing level 1 exam is the amount of content. So even though it's not too much harder material, there is so much more than like a final exam for a university class. If I describe level 1 as maybe equally as difficult as a good finance program, and then levels 2 and 3, in my opinion, maybe 40 or 50% more difficult in that content. How would you compare the difficulty of the classes in medical school or studying for the USMLE Step 1 exam compared to the difficulty of your science classes in undergrad?
For the first year, the basic sciences that we call them, it's pretty similar. It's usually a little bit more in depth. A lot of the times we get very specific research by PhDs in our program, but it's very similar. It really is just the amount of knowledge that we have to know.
So it's similar in difficulty to undergrad, but there's far more information that gets covered in that program.
Yeah, it goes a little bit deeper, but for the most part, the difficulty is about the same.
The basic sciences are relatively equally difficult to undergrad classes. How about the second, third, and fourth year of medical school?
Second year definitely dives deeper. It's actual medicine, really, once you get to that point.
What does that mean? What do you mean actual medicine versus regular science?
As opposed to learning about RNA, about DNA, about how the molecules work together, you learn how a kidney works, how lungs work.
Oh, sure. Here's a good one that maybe some CFA viewers are curious about because there's been some debate on if the CFA exam is worth it. Don't forget to check out my most recent video here. Even though you're not going to remember all of the material studied for the CFA program in your entire career, you will remember the information that's most applicable to the job you're doing now, which is the information that's most important for you. With all the information you mentioned being like non-medicine, basic science info, and then the medicine info, how much of it do you think you actually have to use once you become a doctor?
Well, this is definitely a topic of discussion in medicine. Step 1 is used to essentially weed people out of competitive specialties.
Sure.
If you don't score well on it, you essentially can't do what you want to do.
But it doesn't cover relevant information to the job.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. Are you in that camp? You say that the early science or the level 1 or the first year of medical school information is not actually relevant and not helpful to being a doctor?
I think it depends on which specialty you go into. I went to family practice, so we get to use a little bit of everything. Really, the stuff that you see on step 1 are what we call zebras. If you hear hoofbeats, you're supposed to think of horses. But every once in a while, it's going to be a zebra.
Oh.
Just sort of out there diagnoses that you should think about, but shouldn't be your first thought.
Sure.
And so step 1 is a lot of zebras, which are important to recognize, but it shouldn't be what you look for first.
Right, like if you're working in the ER and people are coming in with heart attacks, you know how to address a heart attack. It's probably not some other rare condition.
Exactly.
For the information after the first year of medical school, what you described as kind of the medicine information, how much of that do you use in your position in family medicine?
That I think a lot more. That I use most of it. Depends on the day, depends on the patient. That's kind of what I like about family practice. You can see a little bit of everything. I think you do get to see quite a bit. And there are people who probably disagree with me, who think step one is a little too much semantics. I think there's a lot of relevant information.
I would compare that kind of to the level 3 CFA exam. Most people in finance, I think, agree that the material covered there, especially because half of it's portfolio management and a lot of the people earning the CFA charter are working in investment decision-making roles. The level 3 exam is the information that's most relevant to people's positions, which isn't necessarily ideal because that's the exam that the least amount of candidates get to. It sounds like relatively similar to the pattern of when useful information is learned throughout medical school.
Actually, we didn't talk about step 2 and step 3 of the USMLE. Step 2, you typically take at the end of your third year, and it's more practical information, more clinic-based, more rotation-based, actual patient presentations typically, and it'll ask you next step in diagnosis or next step in management, as opposed to like a basic science answer that step 1 would ask.
One topic that I am personally interested in but has been pretty controversial on this channel is what IQ someone would have to become a CFA charter holder. In the videos I've argued it's between 110 and 115. With all the people who do become doctors, finish medical school and become a doctor, do you observe that most of these people are really high Q individuals, or do you think someone with enough determination, but maybe only a slightly above average, like 108 IQ, could actually become a doctor?
I think most people could work their way to becoming a doctor.
Most, like more than 50%, meaning including people who might have under average IQ?
Probably not.
Then maybe would you say that in the most difficult or desirable or prestigious pockets of medicine is where the highest IQ people end up going because it's the people who scored the highest on those exams?
That's also kind of debatable.
Okay.
A lot of people think some of the more competitive specialties are people who are just good test takers but don't seem very smart. A lot of people think there's politics that goes into it, who you know. It's more important than what you know. But I think there are certain pockets of medicine that very high IQ people tend to gravitate to.
Which would those be?
Nephrology is definitely one of them.
What does that mean?
Kidney doctors.
Why do smart people like to become kidney doctors?
I don't really know.
If I was a genius working in medicine, that's not where I would want to gravitate, I don't think.
Everyone sort of has their own little opinion on what the most important organ is. Cardiologists think the heart is. Neurologists think the brain is.
That's fair.
Nephrologists think the kidney is.
No, there's no way. No.
It
can't be more important than the heart.
I'm probably more on board with the heart or the brain, yeah, but...
Jordan, talk a little bit about the quality of life while you're in medical school, spending all that time studying, and the finances that come along with that. So how much does it cost? How do you feel like those years of medical school affect you as a person?
Quality of life is going to depend a lot on a lot of things. For me, I was married throughout the entirety of med school. My wife had a job. She didn't make a ton of money, but she had a job and supported us. So I took out loans for all of med school, which was about $40,000 a year. I had classmates who not only had to take out loans for school, but had to take out living expense loans. So they were somewhere around $70,000 a year. Then I had some people who were out of state and had to take living expense loans. And out of state tuition is about 70 grand and another 30 grand for cost of living expenses.
So it might not be unrealistic to come out with like $500,000 in student loan debt.
Certainly not unrealistic.
I know that the spectrums of income can be a lot different depending on what specialty you go into. If you have $500,000 in student loan debt and you pick a 10-year payoff, someone pull out an amortization calculator, you could have a payment of a few $1,000s a month, I'm sure.
Oh, easily, yeah.
What would you say is an average income that someone could look for after medical school?
For residency, you are still not making great money.
What does that mean? How much?
Typically, it's in the $50,000 to $70,000 range. It's set by the government, actually Medicare is who pays residency salaries.
I didn't know that.
I think the base is $55,000.
Okay.
And then a lot of hospitals will add on incentives and such like that. Hospital I work at pays for 80% of our health insurance. They gave us a little bonus yearly.
And then after your 3 to maybe you said 7 years of residency, how much could you hope to earn?
That depends a lot on where you are. So the more rural area you go to, the more you make, typically.
What?
Yeah. It's
More rural areas pay more?
Yeah, it's sort of backwards to everything else, but
Yeah.
it's because you're needed. Doctors bring in a lot of money for hospital systems, and if you have only a couple doctors for a population area that's half the state of North Dakota, probably
Sure.
has 5 doctors in it.
Sure.
You're losing a lot of money. Hospital systems are losing a lot of money by not reaching patients.
What would maybe an average annual salary be?
For family practice, typically somewhere in the $225,000 to $275,000 range. Private practice typically makes a little bit more, but you're spending more time doing business side of things. You can work for a hospital system where a lot of times they will set your salary and give you some incentives. Typically you'll make a little bit less, maybe 200 to 240.
Maybe with an average of 250, how many hours a week are you working in a position like that?
In family practice, most places are close to 40, some are less.
Oh.
A lot of my co-residents who just recently graduated are working 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 with 1 day off a week.
That's not all that different from a CFA charter holder. Probably is relatively common for someone to finish the CFA exams, be awarded the charter, and then earn between $60,000 and $70,000 for a couple years, maybe 3 years. In other videos on the channel, I've talked about the average annual income for a CFA charter holder near the midpoint of their career is somewhere around $180,000. At the later stages, in your late 40s or 50s as a CFA charter holder, you could be in a comparable salary range to what a family medicine doctor might be at. The difference being that some CFA charter holders could have a really high ceiling depending on what position you're in. If you're running a fund and earning a lot of incentive compensation from that fund's performance, there are people making $1 million a year. So what is a scenario in which a doctor would be earning like near the high end of what doctors can make?
Really anything but family practice.
Oh, okay.
No, most surgical specialties, especially private practice. I have some orthopedic surgery friends who take a lot of call. I have a friend who covers 4 hospitals at night. He takes call 5 nights a week typically and makes $5,000 a night that he's on call.
Oh.
$1,000 from each hospital that he covers. And so in just call pay, he made $700,000 1 year, and that's on top of his salary, which was somewhere in the $350,000 to $400,000 range.
You really need to get into the big leagues in the finance industry to compete with some of the big leagues of the medical industry numbers. You shared a lot of information on it. I think any level-headed person would be able to digest from what we've talked about so far that the CFA program is exponentially more difficult than medical school. Do you think that's fair to say?
No.
No, how would you sum up kind of a lot of the things you've said?
One of the ways to think about getting into medicine is getting to med school is sort of the barrier to entry into medicine is getting into medical school. Most medical schools want their graduation rate to be as close to 100% as possible.
Sure.
Even people who do poorly throughout medical school can have some extra years to finish it, but most people will graduate medical school.
And that differentiates pretty significantly, like we touched on earlier, from the CFA exams, because the biggest barrier to entry becoming a CFA charter holder is probably the level 2 exam. Statistically, it's the level 1 exam, but if you set your mind to it enough, you can probably pass level 1. The level 2 exam, the second year, is the thing that will decide on if someone is going to become a CFA charter holder or not. That's usually around age 24 to maybe as late as after age 30 for some people. But with medical school, that's really an undergrad, right? 18, 19, 20.
Yeah, for the most part.
So you need to be on your stuff earlier in life to become a doctor than you do to become a charter holder. I think that's fair. To close it up, it sounds like they are relatively equal in difficulty of content and also chances of getting through the entire programs. Obviously, there are some significant differences, but very different fields. So make your own decision on which one might be more difficult to ultimately get through. But hopefully this video helped you figure it out a little bit. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to gain 10 free IQ points. And as always, thanks for watching.